Welcome back, Source Nation. You're listening to Sports Tuesday with Steve Manderson.
Welcome back to Sports Tuesday. I am Steve Manderson. My guest in a few minutes, Jeffrey Sussman, talking about his latest book, Rocky GRAZIANO, Fits, Fame, and Fortune. Now, let me bring on, again, in continuing with Sports Tuesday's Night of Boxing, my next guest is no stranger to Sports Tuesday. He has been on before. At that time, he was promoting his books, Bear and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes on Boxing. He's here again tonight to promote his latest book, Rocky GRAZIANO, Fits, Fame, and Fortune. Okay? Let me bring on right now, Source Nation, Jeffrey Sussman. Jeffrey,
Hi.
how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Welcome back to Sports Tuesday.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. The first time around, we talked about Max Barr and Barney Ross. This time, we're talking about the legendary Rocky GRAZIANO from when he started out as, I guess, a little punk kid, street kid, growing up on the lower east side of Manhattan, and to what it became later on as an actual television and movie star.
That's right.
Amazing story. A very amazing story. Let's talk about how he started on the streets of Manhattan. Now, he was a problem kid like a lot of kids back then growing up there, What was his childhood like?
Well, he came from a very poor family, so poor that when he was 4 years old, they used to send him out on the street to steal coal for the potbelly stove that they had in their kitchen to heat their tenement apartment, and then they would send him to the beaches of Coney Island to dig up clams so that the family would have some protein in their diet. Rocky's father was a failed boxer and an alcoholic who was very abusive to little Rocky. Incidentally, his name at that time was Thomas Rocco Barbella. He didn't take the name Rocky GRAZIANO until he became a professional boxer. But his father would put boxing gloves on him and then put boxing gloves on his older brother, who was 4 years older, and instruct his older brother to beat up little Rocky. So Rocky was terribly abused as a little kid and very poor. And he had the additional problem that his mother was a schizophrenic, and she was in and out of mental institutions. So he did not grow up in the best possible environment. And by the time he was a teenager, he had turned into a juvenile delinquent. He was a member of a gang, and they used to mug people on the streets and steal things. And it looked as if his life were to continue in that direction. He would have wound up as a professional criminal, probably spending a good part of his life in jail and prisons.
Now, one of his close friends growing up was a guy named Terry Young, who was a boxer at that time, himself, and pretty much took Rocky to the gyms, Stillman's gym especially, and introduced him to fight manager Irvin Cohen. And but at that time, Cohen was kind of skeptical of Rocky in the first place. Why was that? Because of his past as a juvenile?
No, not so much that. It was funny. At the beginning, when he first met Rocky, Rocky was a very handsome young man, and Irving said to him, you're too pretty to be a boxer. Your face is going to get messed up. And Rocky said he didn't care. So Irving put him in the ring with Terry Young, who was a very fine up-and-coming boxer. And Rocky didn't know how to box. He thought that just by being a street fighter, which he was very good at, that he would do well in the ring. He didn't. Terry Young flattened him a couple of times, and now Rocky realized that if he wanted to pursue a boxing career, he would have to learn all the elements of boxing, that it wasn't just getting in the ring and fighting like an animal. There were very specific rules and styles of boxing that he had to learn and then to follow if he wanted to have a career in that field.
Yes, in terms of, and the training methods too, because back then you're talking about the old school type of training. He did the road work, worked the medicine ball and all that kind of stuff to toughen up the middle, things like that. Things that in today's boxing we don't see that much of that anymore. But yeah, go ahead.
He had a wonderful trainer, a man named Whitey Bimstein, who probably trained more boxers in the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s than any other trainer. And Rocky was extremely lucky to have such a good trainer. Now, both Irving and Whitey realized that you had to be patient with Rocky, that he didn't like training, and you couldn't put him on a short leash. You had to let him pretty much do what he wanted to do, but you could also inspire him by various ways to indulge in training, especially if he thought that this would advance his career. But they were constantly urging him on, and Irving became almost a substitute father for Rocky, the kind of father that Rocky should have had but didn't have. And Irving was able to guide him and protect him and make sure that he did the right things for himself. Most managers in those days were not the most honest people in the world, and Irving was a very honest man. He made sure that Rocky invested his money carefully. He said to Rocky one day over lunch, "Look, your career as a fighter is not going to last forever. Boxers don't get a pension the way baseball and football players do. It's very important for you to save your money." And he had Rocky invest his money in annuities so that Rocky would always have an income until the day he died.
Was he a very stubborn type boxer in terms of, was he able to take instruction well?
He didn't take instruction very well. What Rocky had is he had a very powerful right fist, and he would, when he was in the ring against a very tough opponent, he would let that opponent deliver all kinds of punches to him just so he could look for an opening where he could use his right fist. And if he connected with that right fist, invariably he wound up knocking out his opponent. The great fighter Sugar Ray Robinson, who fought Rocky, said that the hardest punch he ever received in his career was from Rocky GRAZIANO.
Yeah, basically like Roberto Duran, hands of stone, pretty much.
Exactly.
Yes. Now, how was his early fights coming up? Because I know back then it wasn't like modern day boxing where they start you out with a 4-round bout here. He pretty much, it was more back then. It was like 15-round bouts.
Yeah, after he got out of the amateurs and became a professional, he was involved in long fights. They were either 12 or 15 rounds, and you had to be in really good condition if you were going to last that period of time. Unless you were planning on knocking out your opponent in the first 2 or 3 rounds, you had to have tremendous endurance to last and continue fighting for 12 or 15 rounds. It was tough.
Yes, I can imagine. Even back then, was I know at that time organized crime was always involved in and around boxing. Was Rocky? Did they try to influence him at times? And if he did, how did he handle that?
Well, there was one time when a group of professional gamblers who were in the mob offered him,
Mm-hmm.
I forgot how much money. I think it was either $10,000 or $100,000 to throw a fight against a fellow who wasn't a very good fighter. The other fighter, his name was Cowboy Shank, and it put Rocky in a very peculiar position. He realized that if he took the money and took a dive and lost the fight, that he would end his career. On the other hand, if he went along, if he said no to the mob, there was a good chance that they would kill him. So what he did is he developed a back injury, and he used the back injury as a way not to participate in the fight. So he wouldn't have to lose the fight, he wouldn't have to win the fight, he just wouldn't be in the fight.
His lifestyle outside of boxing, and this is before he decided to hang it up altogether. What other talents besides boxing was he able to do? What other talents did he have?
He was a very humorous man. He had a wonderful sense of humor, and he also developed a knack for acting, which nobody knew that he had. Once he was on, just to give you an idea of his sense of humor, when he was on the Tonight Show one night being interviewed, he was asked, I think it was by Johnny Carson, who asked him, so you had been a thief as a young man, isn't that right, Rocky? And Rocky said, yes, I was a thief. And Johnny said to him, and what did you steal? And Rocky said, I stole everything that began with an A. And Johnny said, what do you mean you stole everything that began with an A? And Rocky said, I stole a car, I stole a refrigerator, I stole a television, I stole a radio. and he got a lot of laughs from people. And people started realizing that he was a very funny guy. And they regularly invited him back onto television.
That's good. Tell us about Norma Unger. Was this the woman interest of his life back then?
They had a wonderful relationship. Rocky's sister tried to bring them together, and Rocky resisted. And eventually, by accident, they got together, and they went out on a date, and Rocky fell in love with her immediately. What was interesting about Rocky is he had quit school in the 6th grade. He was not well educated at all. Norma Unger had completed high school and had a reasonably good education. Rocky came from as I mentioned earlier, a very poor family. Norma Unger came from a middle-class German Jewish family. They were really opposites, and the fact that these opposites attracted one another was amazing. They had a terrific marriage. He remained faithful to her his entire life. He never fooled around with anyone else. He had found the love of his life in her, and she was very supportive of him, though she never went to one of his boxing matches because she couldn't stand to see him hurt. And whenever he boxed and it was on the radio, she would become so nervous that she'd have to turn off the radio and go into the bedroom and lie down.
So in the beginning, when they first met, how did her family, being being Jewish, how did her family accept him being Italian?
It didn't seem to make any difference to anyone. It's interesting that neither Rocky nor Norma nor either of their two families had any kind of racial or religious prejudice. They just felt that they lived in the world and they took it as it came. He was really, in many ways, ahead of his time in that respect, because it was at a time in America in the 1940s when there was tremendous prejudice against people of different races and religions.
Good point. It's funny too. You say he was faithful to her the entire time of the relationship, and you're talking about a sport where being successful and a good-looking man like Rocky was, you figured the women would constantly throw themselves at him. Obviously, he handled it very well.
It was interesting. I have a friend who is a retired New York City detective, and he used to have to go around to various mob bars to see what was going on. And on a Friday night, he would sometimes go into these mob gathering bars, and he would see these mob guys always with their girlfriends. Occasionally, he'd see Rocky in there because Rocky had grown up with these people, and he was still friendly with them. But he said Rocky was never with another woman. He was always there by himself. He just wasn't interested. He loved Norma, and he was going to spend the rest of his life with her. They had 2 lovely daughters, and that was what he wanted. He wanted a family. He wanted the kind of family that he never had as a child.
Now, as he started getting on in his boxing career, what were his toughest fights? Who were they against?
There was a man named Harold Green who beat him twice, and then Rocky had to, in their third encounter, Rocky beat him. There was a man named Riggio who beat Rocky twice. They never had a rematch, and this fellow Riggio quit boxing after that and became a taxi driver. What's interesting about Riggio is that his sons are the ones who started Barnes & Noble and run Barnes & Noble today. And after that, the toughest fighter he faced was Tony Zale, and they had a trilogy of fights, which are considered the bloodiest fights of the 20th century for middleweights. In the first fight, Zale beat Rocky. In the second fight, Rocky beat Zale, but at one point, Rocky's left eye was so swollen and closed, and he couldn't see out of it, and it was throwing him off. He couldn't see punches coming from the left. And while he was sitting in his corner, his trainer, Whitey Bimstein, took $50 and broke the skin above the eye where it was swollen, and the blood and whatever was in there drained out, and Rocky was able to see finally out of his left eye, and he won the middleweight championship of the world that night. In the third match with Tony Zale, he lost, but at that point, Rocky was already feeling that he had accomplished what he wanted, and he really didn't put his heart into winning that fight. He did want to fight Sugar Ray Robinson because he thought that Sugar Ray Robinson was probably the greatest middleweight fighter of all times, and he wanted to test himself against Robinson. And Robinson knocked him out. I forgot what round it was. But the two of them then became very, very good friends after that. And they were often interviewed together on a number of TV shows. And they would kid each other. They would joke around and so forth. They were like long-lost buddies.
Now, there's a boxer by the name of William Billy Arnold, who, African-American, who a lot of people back then considered him the best of the middleweights. How did GRAZIANO do with him?
He did very, very well. He had studied Billy Arnold, who was a great fighter and a very decent, very nice person, a guy from New Jersey. And he beat Billy Arnold, which is what set him up to proceed against Tony Zale for the middleweight champion. What was sad about Billy Arnold was after he left boxing, he did not have a really good life. He was a very good person, and he was satisfied with the modesty of his life, but he never got the attention and the esteem that he should have gotten for his boxing. And after his fight with Rocky GRAZIANO, he only had a few more fights after that, and then his career kind of petered out. It was a sad story. He was a very nice, very good person.
What would you say was Rocky GRAZIANO's, as a boxer, what would you say was his strength in terms of technique, style, punching ability? What was his strengths back then?
He was really a brawler. He was not what you would call a scientific fighter or a very stylish fighter, the way, let's say, Sugar Ray Robinson was, or Henry Armstrong, or much later in his early career, Muhammad Ali. he would get into a ring and he was out to brawl. And he was willing to take 3 or 4 punches to himself in order to land one solid, good punch against an opponent. He was as tough as they come, and he was a very gutsy fighter. And he would do virtually anything that he had to do to win a fight. If you wanted to beat Rocky, you had to knock him unconscious. Otherwise, he was a very tough fighter to defeat.
So a lot of times back then, he would win. If you didn't knock him down, pretty much you would lose by decision. That's the only way you could beat him. You had to really knock him down.
In many of his fights, that was it. You had to knock Rocky out. There were a couple of fights that he lost on decisions later on. I guess the last 3 fights or 2 fights of his career, he had one big fight after Sugar Ray Robinson with a man named Chuck Davey, and he lost to him on a unanimous decision. But right up until the time he fought Sugar Ray Robinson in 1952, he was winning just about everything by either a technical knockout or a knockout. Very few of his fights were won by decisions.
Okay, but they're not that many, though. That's I would assume.
Right.
He did get into, in 46, he got into some problems. He actually was suspended by the New York State Athletic Commission for failure to report a bribe attempt. What was that all about?
Well, that was what I mentioned earlier when the mob came to him and wanted him to throw a fight. It was part of the New York State Athletic Commission that if a fighter is bribed or if there's an attempt to bribe him to lose a fight, he has to report it to the New York Athletic Commission. Rocky didn't want to report it because he didn't want to get anybody else into trouble, and he figured, as long as he didn't participate, he didn't take the money, he didn't throw a fight, he didn't get involved in it, that it wasn't incumbent upon him to report it. And the New York State Athletic Commission, therefore, revoked his license, and for about 6 months, he couldn't box in New York.
That's interesting because he couldn't benching covered all of the United States. Also, he couldn't fight in Great Britain. He couldn't fight in Cuba, Mexico, anywhere like that. So it was. What did he do during that period when he was suspended?
He was basically a man at odds with himself. He was frustrated. He was angry. He spent a lot of time just brooding about not being able to earn a living as a fighter, and especially in New York, and he thought of New York as his town. He had been, born and raised and bred in New York. It's where he had learned to box at Stillman's gym, and now they took away his right to earn a living. And he figured, when you take away a man's right to earn a living, one of 2 things happen to him. You either become a criminal or you become a bum, and he didn't want to be either one. He wanted to be a boxer.
During that 6-month time of inactivity, when the suspension was lifted, did he show a lot of rust in coming back into the ring? Was he able to at least train during that 6-month period?
Yeah, at that time, Whitey Bimstein and Irving Cohn really took him in hand. And they explained to him, you've been out of commission for a while, and if you're going to make a good show of yourself, you've got to train intensely. And we know you don't like to train. We know you don't like the regimen of it, but you really have to for the sake of your career. And he probably trained more than he had for any previous fight.
Now, during that 6 months, financially, did it set him back a lot, or?
Not a lot. He had to dip into his savings to pay for things, but he had made a fair amount of money up to that time, so he wasn't suffering. But he realized that if the suspension went on for a long period of time, eventually he would run out of money.
Now, his relationship with Sugar Ray Robinson during that time. How was that up until the fight?
Well, they really didn't know each other very much before the fight. Rocky had said to his manager Irving Cohn, he said, "I want a shot at Sugar Ray Robinson. He is the one person that I need to fight to test myself to see how good I am or if I can make it against him." And he went in there giving it his all, and he just didn't have it. And Sugar Ray knocked him out, and but at one point, he looked like he had Sugar Ray on the run, and early in the fight, but Sugar Ray was just kind of calculating his next move. He was a very strategic fighter, and he came back very strong, and he had these very quick combinations. They would happen so quickly that it was almost like watching the hands of a magician. That's how fast Robinson's hands were. And he dealt Rocky a knockout blow, but it was after that fight that they became friends.
During that time, you say that Rocky very much wanted to fight Sugar Ray Robinson. Did Sugar Ray feel the same way about Rocky in terms of wanting to fight?
Sugar Ray was a very confident man, so confident that he was considered arrogant by a lot of people, and everybody who was an up-and-coming fighter who had held the title either as a welterweight or a middleweight at some point wanted to fight Rocky because he represented the best there was. Now, there was only one fighter, as far as I know, that Rocky didn't like, and that was a man named Carmen Basilio. And they fought as middleweights. They had both previously been welterweights, and in their first encounter, Carmen beat Sugar Ray, and in the second one, Sugar Ray beat Carmen. But that was the only fighter that Sugar Ray didn't like. He thought that Carmen Basilio was a bully, and Carmen Basilio thought that Sugar Ray was arrogant, and so they really disliked each other. But Sugar Ray had no negative feelings about Rocky, just like he didn't really have any negative feelings against Jake LaMotta, whom he fought 5 times.
Now, those fights, what were they about? I mean, fighting Jack LaMotta. How did he do against him, and what kind of relationship did the two of them have?
He beat LaMotta 4 times, and once LaMotta beat him.
Wow,
that was all.
Amazing.
Those fights were considered some of the best middleweight fights of all time, and in his last fight with Jake LaMotta, Sugar Ray beat him so badly that the fight was known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre because it happened on Valentine's Day.
Very interesting. In the fight with Sugar Ray, what was if you can remember, what was the betting line on that fight? Because obviously this was one of the biggest fights in Rocky's career, and what were the odds on that fight?
If I recall correctly, I think it was something like 3-1 in favor of Sugar Ray. He was the favorite to win. There's no question about that. But I don't remember exactly what the odds were.
How did Rocky feel about that? I mean, the fact that the odds were against him.
Well, his attitude was, if I win and I bet on myself, I'm going to make 3 times as much. But I don't think he bet on himself. There was one fight I think that he did bet on himself. I can't remember which one it was, but Jake LaMotta in one of his fights with Sugar Ray, I think, bet on Sugar Ray to win.
Really? Wow, that's interesting. That is very interesting. After losing to Sugar Ray, his last fight ended in a loss to Chuck Davey, and that's when he decided to retire and give up the gloves.
Right, that was
How
in
tough?
1952.
Yes. How tough a decision was that for him, having to give up something that meant his entire life and what made him his fortune at that time? How did he feel? How did he handle it when he realized it was all over?
What had been interesting about Rocky is the change in his motivation. When he first started fighting, he was such an angry young man. He had a chip on his shoulder as big as a cinder block, and he just wanted to knock out as many people as he could. Boxing was an outlet for his anger when he started. By the time he retired, he wasn't an angry man anymore. And boxing no longer served the purpose that it had originally served.
So he was able to bow out sort of gracefully with no post-fight anger and regrets of maybe I should have did this way, maybe I should have fought this guy that way. So
no, I
don't
think he had.
Peace with himself.
He was very much at peace with himself. I don't think he had any regrets whatsoever about his boxing career. He did well. He became the middleweight champion. He lost the championship. He was upset when he lost the championship, but he realized also at that point in his life, even when he lost the championship, that he no longer had that angry drive that he had before. And without that angry drive, the reason to be a boxer had kind of dissipated. It wasn't there anymore. And all of a sudden, a new career opened for him. He became an actor. He appeared on television, and he made 3,000 commercials. He said that eventually he made more money doing commercials, he said, than he had during his entire time as a boxer.
Now he did do a lot of short-lived series on television. One I didn't even realize, the Henny and Rocky show with the legendary comedian Henny Youngman.
Right.
How did that relationship start out? Him with Henny Youngman.
Well, people knew what a good sense of humor Rocky had, and they needed a show to follow what was the Friday night fights, and the show would last, depending on when the fight ended, it would last either 15 minutes or up to a half hour, and they needed a straight man for Henny Youngman, who knew also about boxing, someone who could discuss boxing. And they decided that Rocky, because of his sense of humor and his former career as a successful boxer, would be a good straight man for Rocky. And it worked well. So, for example, here's a routine that they did. Rocky would say to Henny, "So I hear, Henny, you have a very good relationship with your wife. Why is that?" And Henny would say, "Well, we go out to a beautiful restaurant twice a week. It's candlelit. There's soft music playing. It's very romantic, and we just love it." And Rocky said, "Oh, you go twice a week?" And Henny said, "Yeah, I go on Tuesday nights, and my wife goes on Friday nights."
Oh, that's a typical joke. Yeah, okay.
Right. And so he would tell those kinds of jokes. Another one that he did that Rocky would be the straight man for, Henny would say, "Did you hear about my friend who went to the doctor?" And Rocky would say, What happened to him?" And Henny would say, "Well, the doctor gave him 6 months to live." And Rocky would say, "Oh, that's terrible. Then what happened?" "Well, the doctor handed him a bill." "Really? And then what happened?" "Well, he couldn't pay the bill, so the doctor gave him another 6 months to live."
Oh God, classic stuff. Yeah, classic stuff. He also was a semi-regular on the Martha Raye show, playing Martha Raye's boyfriend, and then he's done some stuff that shows that I actually remember: the Pat Boone Chevy showroom, Car 54, Where Are You, and The Naked City. Which is interesting. Great shows. And he was in the film Tony Rome. Tony Rome.
He played an ex-boxer in that. He had been a friend of Frank Sinatra. What was very interesting is in the 1940s, before Frank Sinatra became really famous, he was very interested in boxing, and he showed up at Stillman's gym one day. And there was an assistant trainer for Rocky, a guy named Al Silvani. And Frank asked Al Silvani to train him, to teach him how to box. And he did. And, you know, Frank Sinatra was a tiny, skinny little guy at that time. He wasn't tall to begin with. He's only about 5'6" or 5'7", and at the time he only weighed 120 pounds, soaking wet. But he loved boxing, and he met Rocky at Stillman's, and he admired Rocky from the time that Rocky had been had entered the middleweight ranks, and the two of them became good friends. And Frank also became good friends with this guy Al Silvani, and had Silvani in some of his movies. So the three of them, Silvani, Rocky Graziano, and Frank Sinatra, all became buddies as a result of meeting at Stillman's gym.
Well, I'll tell you, he had a good agent. I'll tell you that much.
Well, it was funny. It was funny because when Nat Hiken, who created the Martha Raye show, he also created a whole bunch of other TV shows, sitcoms during the 1950s and early 60s. I don't know if you remember the Phil Silvers show, Sergeant Bilko.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah. Anyway, he was sitting around with one of the producers of the Martha Raye show and the advertising agency, and someone said, you know, we need to get a guy to play Martha's boyfriend. We need a dumb guy, a guy who doesn't talk too well, and you know, it's kind of colorful and so forth. And he said, you know, we need someone like Rocky Graziano. And then the other person said, well, why don't we get Rocky Graziano? So this fellow Nat Hiken went down to Stillman's gym, and there he saw Rocky, and he said, do you have an agent? And Rocky said, I don't have an agent. I have a friggin' manager. Why don't you go talk to him? And so Rocky agreed to be on the Martha Raye show, and they liked him so much that after only a couple of months, they doubled his salary. And he played her boyfriend on the show for as long as the show ran.
Excellent. And also, he was an entrepreneur. He opened up a pizza restaurant on the east side of Manhattan around Kips Bay, which I remember today as a movie theaters on that strip. It was called Rocky Graziano's Pizza Ring. It was pretty successful.
It was very successful, and every once in a while he would be there to welcome customers. And you know, in his later life, he also became an extremely kind and generous man. There's one incident that I relate in my book in which he was at Stillman's gym. This was long after he retired, and he would go there to evaluate the up-and-coming young fighters. And across the room, he saw sitting in a corner an old boxer who had gone blind. Rocky went around to everyone at Stillman's gym and collected money from them, and contributed some of his own money to the collection that he made. And he went over to this boxer and he put the money in the guy's breast pocket, and he said, "This is for you. I want you to come back every month. You're going to get the same thing." So he became so generous with his money to helping out people who were having a hard time that his wife had to put him on an allowance because she was worried that he would give away all of his money.
Well, you know what, though? I can understand that because, you know, he started out with nothing, and he built his fortune up the old-fashioned way, the hard way, in terms of boxing, and he came away with it a successful boxer. I think it was 67-10, and you know, then he turned around, had a pretty decent career in television and movies. So he was. You can look at a man like him, very grateful to what he's accomplished. But yeah, you're right. You know, the wife has to monitor the money because I can see him just giving everything away. You know, at that point. Your overall assessment of Rocky's career, boxer, life after boxing, would you consider him one of the more complete athletes, period,
He was a great athlete. There's no question about it. I think that anyone who rises to a championship position has to have enormous athletic ability. So I think every world champion in whatever weight class they're in has to have terrific athletic prowess, and he certainly did. He was not one of the greatest fighters of all times, but he was a great fighter, and he was probably one of the most colorful fighters of all time, which is why in, I think it was 1956, they made a movie about his life called Somebody Up There Likes Me. And Paul Newman played the part of Rocky Graziano, and the movie made Paul Newman into a star. And that was another lifelong friend of Rocky Graziano, was Paul Newman.
Okay. This has been great. Unfortunately, we are out of time, Jeffrey, but I thank you very much for coming back on the show, and you're always welcome on Sports Tuesday anytime. I'm still continuing enjoying reading the book. It's fascinating.
Good.
I'm also, I look forward to other projects from you. I assume in the boxing era, and this was fantastic. And I considered Rocky Graziano to be a legend, one of the greatest boxers of all time. Where can people get the book?
They can buy it at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. And if you don't mind, I'll just mention the title again. It's called Rocky Graziano, Fists, Fame, and Fortune.
All right. Well, Jeffrey, thank you very much for coming on. You know you got a home here on Sports Tuesday, man, and much continued success and in terms of your books. All right, and we'll definitely be talking down the road.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be interviewed by you.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Take care and God bless.
Same to you. Stay well.
All right now. Source Nation, author Jeffrey Sussman. The book is entitled Rocky Graziano, Fist, Fame, and Fortune. Do get the book. It's always a pleasure to have him on the show. This is his second time around. You know, I definitely have him back on again. As I always say, third time's a charm. But this was great. And again, continued success with Jeffrey Sussman and his publishings, okay, and his future projects. All right, that's it for me. I had a ball here, and until next week, as I always say, be good and be safe. Take care, everybody.
Get at me for beats, y'all.